Okay, so without further ado, well, where are we? Well, we are in Much Wenlock. Funny name, but lots of English places have funny names. Oh, thank you. I got a new sponsor. I don't know who it is. It doesn't tell me, but thank you very much, whoever it was. Much Wenlock is a very ancient place, as we're going to be talking about later. But we're going to start by talking about a man who is probably the best known figure who's going to be very important on our tour. Now we're looking across a sports field and we're looking at buildings of a school. This school is called William Penny Brooks School, and it is named after, guess who? A man by the name of William Penny Brooks, a great figure in the history of this town, a great benefactor of the town and servant of the town in many ways. But he's best known for being the founder of the modern Olympic movement. Now, we think of the Frenchman Pierre de Coubertin as being the founder of the modern Olympics, and that is true, but he was inspired by what William Penny Brooks was doing here in Much Wenlock and elsewhere, and it was after de Coubertin had visited here and seen all of this going on that he went away and started seriously to think about what eventually became the modern Olympic Games. So the school here named after William Penny Brooks, and what doubles as the school playing field is called Linden Field. And Linden Field since 1850 has been the site of what became known and what is still known as the Wenlock Olympian Games. So this began as a local event to promote healthy exercise, fresh air and fitness among local people, organised by their local doctor, William Penny Brooks. And over time it grew to a local level, a regional level, a national level, and eventually an international level. And it's still today. It happened in July this year on this site, all kinds of sports being played for. And William Penny Brooks' contribution is commemorated here with a map of the world. And it's not an ice cream. It's not a cone of French fries. It is an Olympic torch. And this was placed here in 2012 when the London Olympics was taking place. The Olympic flame came here to Much Wenlock, and the mascot of the London 2012 Olympics was named Wenlock after the town where the Olympian movement, the modern Olympic movement, was born. Okay, so as we look straight across the field, we're going to see something else as well. I really have to zoom in. See this little structure on top of the hill? That is a windmill. And it's a windmill that belonged to a wealthy landowning family here called the Gaskell family. And this land also belonged to them. So we're starting on land that belonged to the Gaskell family, and we're going to be finishing our tour at a pub that is named after them. Now, the windmill was actually struck by lightning in the 1850s. And so it wasn't repaired again. And the Gaskell family used to then allow people to set up chairs up there so they had a good view of the games when they were taking place. Okay, so let's leave the playing field and start to make our way towards the town a little bit. As the Wenlock Games, they started, as I say, as a very local event, but they gradually started to spread out and people started to come from further afield. And that became much easier in the 1850s because the railway network in the UK was starting to really be expanded. And in fact, in the late 1850s, William Penny Brooks was one of the main investors in trying to bring a railway line here to the town of Much Wenlock. And he managed to do it so that in 1860, the games for the first time attracted a lot more people coming from further afield. And this is the railway station that was built in 1860. No longer a railway station. The line here closed in 1962, and it is now private homes, station house. I believe there's two separate private residences within there. But interestingly, the railway line wasn't quite finished and inspected by the time that year's games came around. So anybody who wanted to come by train to compete or to watch the games, they had to sign a disclaimer saying that if they was an accident, if the train derailed and something happened to them, they would not be taking any legal action against the railway company or William Penny Brooks or the Wenlock Olympian Games, and they would be just riding at their own risk, so to speak. So quite interesting. And this is also the station where Pierre de Coubertin arrived in 1890 when he came to visit the Wenlock Games. This is where he was met by William Penny Brooks and a delegation of dignitaries representing the town and the games. The reason de Coubertin got interested in this was really the same reason that Penny Brooks started the games up. De Coubertin was part of an organisation, originally in France and then internationally, promoting the idea of physical education in schools and fitness and healthy development. And that was really one of the main concerns of William Penny Brooks. He wanted to give people an opportunity to take courses and to sign up to activities that would improve their health and fitness. He was a doctor, a very highly qualified and respected doctor. So, his interest was in the health of the population. It wasn't just for sporting competition that he did it. So we just crossed over where the railway line would have been. And in the little field here, we got 3 animals that you don't necessarily expect to see in Shropshire. They were much closer to the fence when I walked past there about half an hour ago. But if you go on one of Paul's tours or Craig's tours or Sam's tours in Scotland, you might expect to see these Highland cattle. But here we have 3 of them in this lovely field in Much Wenlock. Beautiful Highland cattle. And of course in Scotland, a Highland cow, because of their accent, it's a coo. And last week I was in Scotland for 4 days. You know how many Highland cattle I saw? 0, none. Even though I was out in the countryside a lot of the time, I come here to Much Wenlock in Shropshire and straight away I see these 3 here. So just goes to show. I kept telling the coach driver I was working with last week, oh, I'll see some Highland cattle next week. And he said, no, why were you? I said, I bet I will in Shropshire. I bet I'll see some on Thursday. Needless to say, I took a photo of one earlier and sent it to him. So anyway, a little bit about the early history of Much Wenlock, because, William Penny Brooks and the Olympian movement, that was all in the 19th century. But Much Wenlock has quite an interesting history going way back beyond that. And the settlement here was first founded around a monastery or an abbey. An abbey was first founded here in about the 7th century AD by an Anglo-Saxon princess by the name of Wilburga. And Wilburga was the daughter of a man called Penda, who was a very powerful military and political ruler. He was the king of Mercia, which was this part of England before England was unified later in history. And so this religious community was founded here in the 7th century, and it was a community grew up around it, a small settlement. And the abbey was replaced in the 11th century by a much larger one. And that was founded by subsequent Earl of Mercia by the name of Leofric. So he was no longer a king because Mercia by that time was part of a united England. He was the Earl of Mercia. And he founded it along with his wife, who is someone you may well have heard of, especially if you have been on one of my tours of Coventry. His wife was Godiva. And yes, the same one who, according to legend, rode naked through the streets. They were the rulers here. They founded the abbey here. And it was added to over the centuries and became a very powerful and very wealthy monastery throughout the medieval period. So it owned a lot of land in the area, a lot of farms, and it also ruled Much Wenlock, so the town was under the control of the monastery. So that meant that they were responsible for justice, and the church was also responsible for collecting all the taxes and tolls that were being paid by the local people and people trading in the markets here as well. Now, the ruins of the medieval monastery are just through the trees here. We can't get a good view of them from this side, but I'm hoping that when we come into the churchyard later, that the trees will not be so overgrown that we can't get at least a little look at part of the priory. So the priory, as it became known, they were here until the 1530s, and like all monasteries in England, they were closed at that time by King Henry VIII as part of our move in England away from the Roman Catholic Church. And at that time, governance of the town, justice and responsibility for the taxes and the markets and everything passed into a secular local council in 1540. And so most of the buildings that we see within the town date from after that period, because that was when local people were running their own affairs and the wealth was going to local people rather than into the coffers of the monastery and into the church. And that's why we see some of the large buildings date from around that period and just afterwards. So the tower here was part of the medieval monastery, the priory, one of their buildings, and behind it is a building that is now a community hall called Priory Hall, but it used to be a school. It was the National School, which was the name of schools founded by the Church of England in the 18th and 19th centuries. So the school that I went to was a national school, Hucknall National School. This was Much Wenlock National School. And it was a school that Dr. William Pennybrooks was associated with, because one of the things that he was doing during his career was trying to campaign for physical education to be a compulsory part of the curriculum in schools in England. So that was how, he came in touch with de Coubertin and other people spreading this message around the world at that time. First of all, he petitioned the government and they turned him down. So he decided that he needed a little bit more evidence if he was going to go back to them. So what he did was conduct an experiment using kids from the school. Now, it's not like he didn't have them in a lab. They weren't like lab rats. But what he essentially did was to measure the physical development and health and fitness of a control group of boys at the school who were not having the physical education teaching and classes that he recommended, and that of a group who were, and the development and fitness and health of the group that were getting the physical education proved to be better. And that gave him much more evidence to submit to the government. And eventually his ideas were adopted quite late in his life in the 1890s. But yes, that was the school where he conducted these, I guess you call them experiments, but I mean, they were not, there was nobody harmed. Some of them just got a bit fitter than others. David and Wendy, yes, just boys, because the school would only have, I don't know whether the school would have had boys and girls in it at that time, but I think it made it easier as a comparison, because you were comparing the development of boys with the development of other boys, and certainly you wouldn't then have to take into account any difference in the development that as a result of gender. And I think also it would mainly have been boys who were doing physical activity and sports at that time as well. So the street here is called Bullring, telling us this would have been where medieval cattle markets would have been. A little bit different to the Bullring in Birmingham, which is the commercial centre of the modern city. We have this beautiful timber frame building here, and you can see this has windows on all kinds of sides. And that tells us this typical shape that this would have been a toll house. So this is the road out of town. So if you're going into town to the markets, you would have to stop and pay your toll. If you're going out of town, you'd probably pay a toll to use the roads. And they have the windows on each side so they can see you coming. It's now called Humbug Cottage and is a sweet shop, although I've never actually seen it open. I don't think it's been a sweet shop for years. But it might be a holiday cottage now. Now, across the way here is Holy Trinity Church. So this is the church of the townspeople. So even when they had this huge monastery there, with a much grander church than this at one time, the local people wouldn't have gone to church in the monastery. That was just for the monks and high-ranking guests. So this is the church of the local people, and it's a very old church, a Norman designed church. As you can see, it's not in a Gothic style. It's in a Norman style with a square tower, the rounded windows and archways. Dates back to around the 12th century. You can see the quite rough stonework on it, and it's been sort of restored and added to at various points. Unfortunately, I know from experience we can't get a signal inside there, because I did try on one tour and I stepped inside and everything looked good, and then my signal disappeared and I lost everybody on the tour. So I learnt my lesson. So what we can see here is the fact that Much Wenlock, around sort of from the 16th to the 19th century, was a pretty prosperous place. There was a lot of agriculture and early industry going on around here. We're close to where the Industrial Revolution began, and vast expanses of agricultural land and very important trading routes going through the area. So the town had quite a facelift, and you can see a lot of these beautiful Georgian style brick built buildings like these here from the 18th century. And one of them, the one with the blue plaque on across the road, was the birthplace of Dr. William Pennybrooks. And he was born in that house across the way there. Step back so we can get the entire house on without tripping over. He was born there in 1809. His father was the town doctor. You can see, pretty wealthy family, but doctors would have been wealthy at that time. There was only wealthy people could afford to get good medical care back then. And Dr. William Pennybrooks and his brother both followed in their father's footsteps, went off to study medicine, and he studied in this country. Hi, Bethany, nice to see you. And then he also went to Paris as well to continue his studies. But while he was over there, he got the news that his father had died unexpectedly. So William Pennybrooks and his brother, they came back to Much Wenlock sooner than they really would have wanted to, and probably he didn't really intend to come back here, certainly not so early in his career, but he came back here almost as soon as he had qualified to take over his dad's doctor's practice here in the town, and he lived in that house for the rest of his life. So when Pierre de Coubertin came here in 1890, that is where he went to have dinner and to have meetings with William Pennybrooks as they were talking about fitness and the Olympian ideals and the possibility of having an international games that eventually became the Olympic Games as we know today. Now, as you may well know, the first modern Olympics took place in Athens in 1896, and de Coubertin very much behind that. But unfortunately, William Pennybrooks never got to see it because he died in 1895, just a few months before the first modern Olympics took place. I'm going to go and see his tomb in a moment. I just wanted to show you this lavender here. Look at all the bees on here. They're loving this lavender. They are loving this lavender. Look how many there are. Wow. I've seen lots of shops selling local honey. I would not be surprised. Yes, okay, we don't want you on the gimbal. I've got a bee on my gimbal. Now, you go away. The lavender's much better for you than the gimbal. But beautiful to see the bees and to have people producing local honey in the area. So let's get another look at the side of this church. See, this is a slightly later additions to the church. We go towards slightly later style with pointed windows rather than curved. But it's every bit a medieval church, heavily restored in the 19th century. And I bet you can't guess who stumped up quite a bit of the cash for that. Might that have been Dr. William Pennybrooks again? Yes, it was. He was responsible for an awful lot of good works and developments within the town. But while he was very well respected and very successful in what he did, his personal circumstances were quite tragic. And in fact, when he passed away, this is his tomb here, in memory of William Pennybrooks, died December the 10th, 1895. But this tomb and the tomb behind me tells us that his brother, his wife, and 4 of his 5 children died before he did. So he lost an awful lot of family and had an awful lot of personal tragedy in his life, despite his many successes and achievements. Now I'm going to walk down to the end of the churchyard so we can take a peek over the wall and try to get a little look at the ruins of the medieval monastery. We might not see a huge amount of it, but we might at least get a little look through the trees without me risking life and limb to try to clamber over anything. Here's part of the ruin we can see there. It's not too overgrown, actually. Nothing's been growing much because of the very hot and dry weather. Yeah, there we see some. Let me zoom in. I can zoom in on that, and you see it's a huge monastery complex, but it is in ruins from its closure in the 1530s. So fantastic ruin there now. It can be visited. It's in the care of English Heritage. It can be visited if you are ever in the area. So there's beautiful trees here. These giant sequoia, beautiful willow tree in the churchyard as well. A lovely cedar tree. Really is a beautiful spot in the churchyard of this medieval Holy Trinity Church there, with the sun coming out right on cue. Look at that. Shining in my eyes so I can't see the screen anymore. Typical. So let's go on a little bit. Got the quite elaborate tombstones, and again I think some of the monuments in the cemetery here, they kind of reveal a town that was pretty prosperous, where people can afford to commemorate their loved ones in quite an elaborate way within the local churchyard. Now, we just saw a little bit of the ruins of the monastery, and I mentioned earlier that when the monastery was closed, the priory, Wenlock Priory, a new town council was created. And in 1540, to be the headquarters of the new secular government of Much Wenlock, they built this building. Timber framed building. It's been added to over the years, but essentially pretty much the timber frame building as we see it today. The Guildhall is looking pretty much as it would have done originally in 1540. Now what you have upstairs is enclosed, and that is where the local dignitaries would have met. It's also where the local courthouse would have been. So remember, I said they're taking over the administration of local affairs and justice from the church. So they had their courthouse, and that was upstairs. And actually, there was a courthouse in that building until 1985. It was redeveloped in the 19th century. Some random guy called William Penny Brooks, he was a justice of the peace, involved in local justice, and he paid out of his own money to have the rather dilapidated courtroom of the Guildhall restored, and to also build a better sort of meeting room for the local council to meet in. Talking of the local justice, within a couple of years of the courthouse being there, they passed a sentence that has got its own rather grim place in English history, when an 11-year-old girl was hanged for theft. And she was the youngest female ever to be executed in this country. She was executed alongside two men, 11 years old. So that was in the early 1540s, just after the courthouse had been in place. So the Guildhall had the courthouse and the local government sort of on the upper floor, and on the lower floor was an open arcade. It still is today. They have a fruit and vegetable and flower market in there several days a week, and that's exactly what it was. It was a market hall. We're going to see it from the front in a moment because it's easier to see. But the market hall, very important as a sort of a communal place, and of course very convenient having the market hall where you collect your tolls for people trading in the market, right next to the place where the money and the local business is administered. So they're dealing with crimes. There were some pretty gruesome punishments back in the day, hangings, and also public floggings. And public floggings would generally have taken place on market day, because then you'd have the maximum number of people to witness it and make an example of the person who's been convicted. And a great view here of the Guildhall with the church tower in the background. And one of the things that we still have on the market hall here are these shackles. So this is where the people who are being flogged would have been chained to. These are the shackles here that would have been used to shackle the people who were going to be flogged or have some other horrific thing done to them on the market day here. So really quite a gruesome part of the history, but you can see this market hall really still in quite good condition. And what we have on the wall here, what you might be able to see here, lots of signs: Borough of Wenlock, and then the names of other villagers, places around here. Some of them you might recognise, like Ironbridge, Colebrookdale, places we've been on tours. The Bourton there is not Bourton on the Water, that's way down in the Cotswolds. And that's because not only did the courts and the local governance here cover the town of Much Wenlock, it covered a huge rural borough, so an area that came under the control of the local authority here. And it covered about 71 square miles, 180 square kilometres, and that made it the second largest area of local governance in England, outside London. Of course, in terms of population, wealth, and all the rest of it, it was nowhere. But until the late 20th century, it remained the second largest area of local governance in the country after London. So we're in the heart of the town, the market square, and we can see the Wenlock Jubilee clock, also known as the Cook clock. You have to be careful how you say that. And it was commissioned and actually financed by a mayor of Much Wenlock to commemorate the Golden Jubilee of Queen Victoria in 1897. His name was Thomas Cook, nothing to do with the Thomas Cook who was the first travel agent, just a coincidence. And so this was installed in 1897, and it was restored in 1993 to mark 40 years of Queen Elizabeth II being on the throne, 40th anniversary of her coronation. And what you can see is that they used the town clock as the meeting point for the communication lines, the telephone cables going to all the different buildings here. And one of the things I saw in the museum earlier was a picture of this from 1950 something. And none of those wires were there. It was before all of the individual buildings were hooked up to the communications network. So it looked slightly different back then. And around it you have, as you would always have done on public spaces then, you need public drinking fountains before you had a proper mains water supply. So there's a public drinking fountain here and little drinking troughs here for dogs. Bring your dogs and get them some water here. And next to it is a modern sculpture of an acorn, and this was installed as part of the London 2012 celebrations when the role of Much Wenlock in the Olympian ideal was celebrated, and was installed an acorn, and it says, you might be able to read it, but if not, it says, "We've time and talent not to be buried. Plant a tree and you give the future a present." So lovely words and a lovely sculpture of an acorn, and it fits in very much with what William Pennybrook's idea was of encouraging health, fitness and well-being from a young age, that goes through your life with you, like the idea of planting an acorn. So there's a lovely little building across the way that's now the town museum. It was originally a community hall. Later it was a cinema. So this was a little local cinema in the 1950s and 60s. And later then it became a community hall again, and now it is the museum and tourist information. So let's take a walk up what is the main shopping street, High Street, as is often the way. You know, the main street in towns in England, they tend to be called High Street. It's nothing to do with their altitude, it's to do with high, just in the sense of main and importance. So here's one of several very, very ancient pubs that we have here in Much Wenlock, the George and Dragon Inn. This is a building that has a brick front, but it's got a much older stone and partly timber-framed structure behind it. And it dates back originally to around the 16th century. And it's got a great pub sign, George and the Dragon. Now, I'm not sure anywhere in the legend that I've seen does St. George sit down and have a drink with the dragon, but that's exactly what he's doing here. He's having a flagon with his dragon. What could be better than that? And you can see some of these old little passageways, and they're not called cycling prohibited. This is called the George Shut. And a shut, that's a local word here in Shropshire for little passageways and alleys and so on. Later I'm going to be in Shrewsbury, which is the biggest town in Shropshire, and you'll find a lot of the medieval passageways, the little streets, are called the shuts. So across the way is a lovely and quite grand building. This is called, well, it's actually called the Corn Exchange. because originally it was built as a corn market, so for agricultural trade. MB, the difference between a shut and a close, nothing. A shut is the local word here for them. A close is a word that is used a lot in Scotland. In Edinburgh, you get a lot of these little alleyways that are called closes. And a close would just be a small street. It is kind of a general English word. But a shut is a very specific Shropshire thing. Whereas a close is much more commonly used in Scotland. So this was originally an agricultural market, the Corn Exchange. But we can see the black sign, library. And it was a library originally set up here in 1842. Sorry, by that man again, William Pennybrookes. First of all, he set up a library here. It was one of the first public lending libraries in England. Public in the sense, not that it was owned by public, it was owned privately, but it was open to the public. And it was called the Agricultural Reading Library. And that meant that local people, farmers, could go there and they could borrow books. And he wrote to a lot of wealthy people all around the country and asked them to donate some books from their collections to his library, so that they could have a more extensive library that people could actually start to learn more about the world around them. So, he was trying to improve the education of local people. And then in 1852, on the upper floors of this, he set up a more extensive library and also an educational institution. And that was where the Wenlock Olympian Society was formed. And the Wenlock Olympian Society was where the whole Olympian Games and the modern Olympics grew out of. So that was a place where local people could enroll in courses for physical education, learn more about health and well-being and fitness. And that kind of grew then through the decades along with the games. So it's all, William Pennybrookes. We walk around this town and all of the things we see, a lot of the achievements that have happened here over the years are down to his far-sightedness, his concern for the well-being, and not just of people in his own town, but he kind of experimented in his own town on a small scale. And when the ideas worked, he then tried to get other people to buy into them and to export them around a little bit. This is still a little library, you can see, just a small local library today. I'm not going to go too far in because I'm losing my signal, but we can see. And well, there's another one, another second-hand bookshop. Much More Books Limited, and a play on the much in the name of the town there. What a beautiful little bookshop. Okay, so let's take a little walk up the high street. I like the fact that the sun's out, but not the fact that it's in our eyes here. And what we're going to see up here are a couple of very, very old Much Wenlock buildings. A lot of what we've seen, apart from the church and the Guildhall, they are Georgian, or at least the fronts of them are Georgian. But here we're going right back to the 16th century, and look at this beautiful house here. This is called Reynolds Mansion. And the Reynolds family were very wealthy agricultural merchants in Much Wenlock. So they were trading and transporting a lot of the agricultural produce from the rural areas here, trading in the markets, making a lot of money out of that. And they were able to buy or build this fantastic house. It dates back to the middle of the 16th century. So around the time, again, that the power was being transferred from the church to secular authorities. Laurel, the word much, well, it means a bigger version. So there's another village nearby called Little Wenlock. So Wenlock is an old, sort of old, very old English, possibly even Celtic word. It meant the white area, and that refers to the limestone. So the local rock here is, there's a limestone sort of section running through the middle of Shropshire known as Wenlock Edge. And that's where the rock is very specifically a lighter colour than the rocks. And so there was Much Wenlock, there was Little Wenlock. Maybe in history there were other things around Wenlock, so it was just the larger of the settlements around this particular limestone belt area. So the Reynolds family, they would have been trading their goods here, investing their wealth in this beautiful house. I don't know what's happening to it at the moment. It's looks, I mean, it's empty. I don't know whether it's being used partly for holiday accommodation. I know it sold for a few years ago for almost £1 million, but looks like it needs to be renovated and acquired again in the moment. Here's another very ancient pub. It says there, 13th century. So the frontage we see is not 13th century, that's later, but certainly a very, very ancient building. And that would have been probably created as a guest house by the monks from the monastery here originally. It's now called the Talbot Inn. And Talbot, you get a lot of things called Talbot around here for two reasons. One, Talbot is a breed of hunting dog, so that's why you see the dog on the sign there. And Talbot was also the family name of the Earls of Shrewsbury. So Shrewsbury, the biggest town in Shropshire, and so the Earls of Shrewsbury were the most important family around here. So on Wenlock Edge song, yes, absolutely, Laurel. MB, if that were cleaned up, no, the sections between the wood would not be white. They are their original colour. So any timber frame buildings like that that's white, they've been whitewashed later. That's what the original colour was, just like when we go to Shakespeare's birthplace down in Stratford. The white was a much later kind of like here we see, this is a much later kind of decorative style on the timber framed buildings. Here we got an old building that recently contained a bank, but it's very interesting because it is being renovated. As we come around the side of it, look, we can see you've got the original timbers. Look how these are hundreds of years old. But then down here, they're building new. And instead of the other materials between there, they're using bricks between the timber framing here. But they're rebuilding it as much as they can in a kind of in keeping with what would have been. No, the original would not have been brick. The original would have been wattle and daub, which is interlaced sticks and twigs, and then a mixture of mud, clay, blood, hair, whatever you could get that would make a coat that you could coat everything in and that would set hard using agricultural produce. Later, people, when they started to renovate these houses and add to them, they used bricks. But bricks were not a viable building material for anybody but the most wealthy until really the late 18th, early 19th centuries when they were being produced industrially. Before that, bricks were very, very expensive luxury building materials, which is why you see, for example, quite a few Tudor palaces, places like Hampton Court Palace, they built a brick because that was a luxury material in those days. So this is a fascinating building called Ashfield House, and it's in two parts. So you can see the part at this end has the timber framing. This is the later section. It was built in the 16th century. The earlier section, the stone part on the left-hand side, it's 14th century. And parts of this building belonged to the monastery, and they were the Hospital of St. John. Now, a hospital did not mean what it means today. Back in those times, a hospital was a place where travellers or pilgrims or people who were visiting the monastery for religious purposes could stay. Yes, if people were sick and needed to stay somewhere for a while, they could stay there, but it was not a place specifically designed for medical treatment. You know, the word hospital, it's linked to the word hospitality. And so the stone sections of this building were part of the 13th, 14th century Hospital of St. John, which was run by the monks here from the abbey. And later it was acquired by a wealthy family after the closure of the monastery, and they added to it and added the timber framing, which was the latest fashionable style of building at the time, and created this huge building out of it. Okay, we're just going to make our way up to the end of the road here, because we began at the site of the Wenlock Olympian Games. And I said that the land up there, Linden Field, belonged originally to a family called the Gaskell family, who were very wealthy landowners. And one of the things that happens to this day, at the beginning of the Olympian Games, there is a grand opening ceremony, and that is preceded by a huge procession through the streets of Much Wenlock. It's real pageantry with flowers and colours and flags, and all of the buildings along the route are decked out in their finery. And that then concludes with the opening ceremony up on Linden Field. But it begins here. It begins here at the Gaskell Arms Hotel, which was originally a early 16th century Tudor manor house, and later became an important inn, because we're on the main road here. So this was a coaching inn. People could stay overnight as they were travelling through this region. And it was owned by this family, the Gaskell family. And one of the Gaskell family was a friend and supporter of Dr. William Pennybrooks and his Olympian Games. He was a man by the name of Thomas Milne Gaskell, and he was a local politician. He was a member of Parliament for Much Wenlock at the time, and was kind of an important figure in the creation of the games and the spreading of this message around. And so the procession to this day starts here at the Gaskell Arms Hotel. And back in the early days, of course, during his lifetime, William Pennybrooks himself would give a speech here on this spot to start off that year's games. And then the procession would take place, the opening ceremony, and then let the games begin. The sport would take place. And I think let the games begin is a very fitting way to summarise the achievements of William Pennybrooks, because he would have, without his contribution, we don't know whether there'd have been an Olympic Games, whether it or when it would have been, but he inspired people like Zapas, who was very influential in Greece, and de Coubertin himself. So, it's a massively important contribution in terms of the modern world that Pennybrooks made, not only internationally but to this town. And we've seen the different things he did, but I said at the beginning, it is quite a quirky little town, and it's got some interesting history. It's got some fascinating buildings, some beautiful spots to see, and I hope you've enjoyed looking around it with me this afternoon. I missed a couple of questions. Tricia, are there any working monasteries left. No, there are no working monasteries left. They were all closed. There are some monasteries now, but they are all modern ones that have been founded within the last 100 years or so. You know, none of the monasteries that were around at that time survived because they just were closed. They were part of the Catholic Church, and they were just closed down. But there are some monasteries in Britain, in England today, not really that many. So, hope you've all enjoyed this stroll through history, a stroll through this lovely town of Much Wenlock. Thank you so much to all of you for joining me. Thank you for your good spirits, for your humour. Thank you for your questions to keep me on my toes.